Today the session is keeping open source open, and it's been a hotly debated topic, but let me just introduce my hot panel to my left here. So first here is Matt, and actually most of you know the folks on the panel, I hope, but I'm going to just very quickly, three hashtags. So he's an entrepreneur, a journalist, and most recently I found that Matt has a law degree, so a lawyer as well.
So I can, in fact, sue each person in this room.
I can do that without a law degree. A lot cheaper.
So Vicky's an author. She's an open source business strategist and a connector in the community, a meta community connector. Next is Matt Wilson. Matt's an engineer. He's a former Red Hatter, and he's an AWS VP. And then next to Matt is Adam Jacobs, who doesn't look like his Twitter picture at all. Adam is an entrepreneur. Sustainability is another hashtag. And metalhead is the other. And then last but not least is Tiffany Harris, who's on the board of directors of the Drupal Association with a community perspective here. And she's a business owner and change agent. So
And it's Ferris.
Ferris. So that's a panel. And but before we start, I'm going to ask the audience. So how many are regular users of Twitter? Okay, so that's not all the hands. Okay, that's good, because then what I'll do is I'll provide a short summary of the hotly debated topics. And so at least then that kind of gets everybody onto the same page. And that's some of what the panel will be discussing here. So over the last 20 years, open source has really evolved. And it's evolved from a mature model, from individual developers coding to a mature model and a large ecosystem with many enterprise developers participating as well. And from like the developers scratching an itch to really engagement in the enterprise and in cloud users of open source. So we haven't really. I feel like open source hasn't really shifted from the original objectives, and it's grown much more in depth and much more in breadth as well. 20 years ago, we saw an explosion in licenses and fragmentation as well, with various new licenses, and also with the MPL, with SPL, with the CUDL. So there was just, every couple of weeks it felt like a new license coming out. And what's happening now in the industry, I feel is not new. It's not very different to what we were feeling and what we were seeing 10, 15 years ago. Back then it was because companies didn't understand open source, and they were trying to hold on to commercial, provide their own interests, commercial interests and provider interests. Is it the same thing today? It doesn't sound new to me, but those are the questions I'm going to ask the panelists and that they're going to hotly debate. And whether, how are these licenses, how are these changes in business model, how do they help developers? Is it just a handful of VCs trying to make money? Is it, all kind of the same thing? Or is it just a loud noise right now, and that's all it is? And we're facing a lot of questions, and these are some of the folks online that are actually debating and answering some of these questions. So there's a lot of undeniable angst out there between open source and the cloud. And there's some fundamental beliefs within the community that there is one open source definition, and that if we limit the number of people engaging in open source, we also limit the portability of open source. So rather than taking it from me, I'm going to ask this kind of bunch of experts that I have here, looking at it from not just a market perspective, but also a community perspective, a foundation perspective, and customers and partners as well. So let's have that conversation. And my first question is to Matt. So you built a whole bunch of business models around open source with many different companies, right? And maybe you can talk about the different business models and the licenses you've developed, what you see today, what's working.
Sure. And I'll just say parenthetically that I'm a little nervous. I've never been speaking in front of Corey while he was tweeting, but now that I always enjoyed it when he did it to other people, but I've never enjoyed it this close and personal. So I think the common thread over the last, I don't know how many years, 20 years say, has been as open source took off with developers, money looked at that phenomenon and said, how can I have some of that? And often with the companies that I've been with and that companies that I'm not now with that I see out in the industry, it seems to be an exercise in trying to figure out how to take the benefits of open source, open distribution, getting the software out there, riding on the backs of developers into an enterprise, and then giving back as little as possible. And specifically, the big concern now that's been raging, maybe it's a tempest in a teapot, but I think it's real, is people trying to figure out, well, what do we know what open source was as defined in the server era. What does it mean in the cloud era? And how do we encourage those contributions back without being consumed by the public clouds? And specifically, I mean, I'll say it, I know we're at AWS Open Day, but how do we avoid being consumed by Amazon? At a company with which I'm very familiar, we had the AGPL license that we used, the Affero GPL license, but internally we called it the Amazon GPL. And it was specifically designed to keep Amazon at bay, even though, as near as I could tell, Amazon had no intention to come in and do anything with our code. But that's kind of the latent fear, I think, in the industry.
So how did that work out for you? You made some changes?
Sorry?
Did you make some changes? Like what was the result of that?
Well, that company is now public, and selling the stock felt really good. But I don't think actually any of the benefit to that company came from those licensing changes. It came more from the company figuring out the cloud. But I don't want to monopolize this. So
yeah.
The company is MongoDB.
It is in fact MongoDB.
That's great.
Wait, okay.
Adam, I guess you can relate that to your experience at Chef maybe and talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, I ran. I'm Adam. I was the CTO at Chef. Chef built configuration management software, and also some application automation software, and also some security and compliance software. All of which was open source. We started out with like a SaaS business model where we were. All the code was open source, and then we would run it for you. Turned out large enterprises didn't want us to do that because they were like, I don't want all my configuration data in the cloud. And so then we became an open core company where we took our SaaS thing and then sold that for money. And then eventually we got to a place where the dynamics of trying to talk about what was open source and what was closed source was causing more friction in our own community and then also in our customer base. Like there was this weird game of when you're open core, what happens is you have this open thing in the middle and then you put proprietary software on the outside. And deciding where the line is actually really hard because like, I don't know, is it a good line or a bad line? And you try to justify it by like a given customer making a choice. And so most recently we transitioned to just being completely open source. All the software is free and open source. And what our business model is very similar to Red Hat's. The way it works is if you would like to buy it, you can buy it from Chef, and only Chef can produce Chef. And the community is producing a different distribution. It's called Sync, and we're all working together to do that. And it's had really good side effects, both for the business and then also for the community. Like for the first time, the community can make a build of Chef, which I know sounds ridiculous, but like it's actually a big deal. Like prior to that, you might have thought it was open source or whatever, and it was, but you couldn't like take it and create it. Just like that was not a thing that a mortal could do. Like you had to work at Chef to be able to do that, and you can now. There's alternate hosting and all sorts of stuff that has cropped up over time. So So yeah, we took a different route than Mongo's, and it was partly because we had like a core value around community and around that engagement, and not just the developer community, but also the user community of Chef.
Sure. So I started my career at Red Hat back in 1998, and we built software the way that Chef is. We took a lot of open source, free and open source software. We packaged it into a product, into Red Hat Linux originally. You could buy it at Barnes & Noble or Borders, download it on the internet. And over time we shifted at Red Hat to building software for enterprises. But like Chef, the only place where you can get Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or the official version of Red Hat Linux, is from Red Hat. And I have an interesting kind of experience of working at Red Hat, and also now working at Amazon, where Amazon was an early customer of Red Hat. And that Amazon moved its e-commerce website business to run on top of Red Hat Linux back in around 2002. So it's a very early adopter of Linux. And so I was a vendor to Amazon when I was at Red Hat. And then when I came to Amazon, I was a customer of Red Hat. One of the things that kind of shaped what we built at Amazon was that Red Hat decided that they were going to make a strategic change in their technology stack. They decided that they were going to move from investing in Zen as an open source software ecosystem to investing in KVM. But Amazon had built a smaller cloud business, EC2, on top of Zen. Back in 2006, we launched that. But Red Hat decided that they weren't going to support it anymore. So we had the freedom with free and open source software to be able to build Zen ourselves. And that's one of the things that really, when I joined Amazon 9.5 years ago, so one of the first things we were doing was kind of moving from Red Hat Enterprise Linux and that code base of Zen to working on upstream Zen. And so since then, we've become much more involved in upstream Zen development. So it's kind of changed. I think that this pattern is one that I start to see more often with enterprises as they're adopting the cloud. They're moving from being vendors to sometimes building directly on top of open source and then becoming larger contributors over time. So it's an interesting kind of larger trend that I'm seeing.
So I think a lot of the conversation, one of the things I do in my abundant free time is I study failure, like of all sorts across all industries, failure. And what I see happening a lot here is us focusing on what's right in front of us, which is cloud, because it's easy. And that's just a human tendency in all things that we do. We focus on what's right in front of us, right? It's lots of cognitive biases around this, rather than delving deeper for the actual reasons and some of the more difficult things that you might have to solve and you might have to resolve. Instead, we'll focus on cloud, and we'll blame Amazon, unfortunately. I'm sorry you're being everybody's whipping boy, but that is the way it is right now, because you are the biggest whipping boy on the block, frankly. So, we are focusing on cloud and how cloud is changing open source, because it's a different world now, because cloud. No, it's not. What we actually have is we have a world where most of the people who are doing this technology grew up with free and open source software. Those of us who have been around for a very long time, I've been in the free and open source software community for nearly 30 years now. And sorry, folks, I'm 47, so that's great deal of my life. So I remember a time before that. I remember before free and open source software was a big deal. I remember when the open source definition came out. And there was a great push for everyone to understand at that point what open source is. Look, we've defined it. Oh my gosh, how great is this? We now can all use the exact same language for what open source is. Just as the FSF did with the 4 freedoms and what free software is, the OSD expanded and built upon that for the open source definition. And everyone who needed to know what open source was knew what open source was. And we all could communicate very, very effectively. But then we stopped. Then a lot of the evangelism around what open source is just sort of stopped. And a lot of the people who would need to learn that definition didn't hear it, or if they learned it, it was via the telephone game. I heard it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who spoke to someone else, And so what I've found in the past 5, 10 years or so is that most of the people I speak with in this newer generation in technology don't even know there is an open source definition. They don't know there is a single definition of what it means to be open source. So of course you're going to have arguments. Of course you're going to have misconceptions because you have people working under their own special delicate snowflake definitions. And my definition is in my brain, and your definition is in your brain. We're using the same terms, but we have different meanings. And so that is a big part of the problem, is that we need to fix this. We need to do the very difficult problem of backfilling all of this education so people really know what it means to be free and open source software. And if you do that, then you can see that this whole cloud thing, that's just a straw man. That's the easy thing for us to poke holes in because we're not going to deal with the difficult problems. And those are all people. They're not technology.
Well, no.
Vicki, do you?
Go ahead, dear.
I'm only asking a question, then I'm giving it back to you.
Oh, I want to make sure Tiffany gets some chance.
But do you think that is that a problem of, is it a definite? I remember if you look at GitHub, and I don't know if the problem persists as much today, but at one time the majority of repositories didn't have a license at all, like they just hadn't thought about it or just didn't care. I called it the GitHub generation, that we were post, and I think James Governor said we were post open source. Is it almost to the point of just complete freedom? There are problems that come with that. As a lawyer, I'll say there are problems that come with that, but complete freedom, do whatever you want. Is it really that, or is it that the money that's come in has a different idea of what freedom means or should mean? Freedom for me to spread open source everywhere, freedom for you to pay me for the proprietary version of that software. So do we, at a developer level, do we have a definitional problem, or do we have a problem at the one step up, if that's the right way to say it?
We have a problem across the entire industry. And that includes developers and business people and everything. I mean, we have these people who think it's okay to just release your source code without a license and then call it open source. Well, no, at best that's source available. That's still all rights reserved code, and that is still not open source. I am still not legally allowed to use your code. I can't build a startup on your code and then have it acquired, because those auditors, they're going to freak the heck out. And they're not going to allow that acquisition to go through. But we have done a poor job of education across the board. And so people aren't aware of this fact. All they know is open is available. Well, yes, but again, it's bigger than that. And maybe we should start educating people so they are aware of that, because otherwise we're going to continue down this spiral and things are not going to get better. So we have to empathetically correct people rather than getting in their face and saying, no, put a darn license on this, or no, that's not open, or no, we can't have new licenses, or no, we can't do this. That's not going to help free and open source software. We have to allow it to evolve, but we can't have it evolve unless people all understand what it is, unless we're all on the same footing. Because otherwise, we'll have forks, which can be healthy, but...
Yeah, I think education is really a big component of this that all of us as a community are responsible for. But Tiffany, if you can kind of bring in the community perspective into keeping open source open, what this means to communities and how does it affect them?
Well, I think what we're dealing with is, to build on what VM was saying, is that we're dealing with a success problem. The fact that people are choosing open source not because it is open source is ultimately a sign of how well we've done. We've created software that is fundamentally the best choice, right? The right product. And from the business model perspective, I think there's now broad-based acceptance that you want to own as little bespoke code as possible, right? That there is a public good to this, and that having that shared infrastructure benefits us all. So from the community perspective, wearing my Drupal hat, right? There is no single entity that pushes forward Drupal. about halfway through our current lifespan, Dries obviously did Acquia, and I know that there's a perception that Acquia runs Drupal or something else like that, but the reality is that they contribute, not most of the code, right? Not even half. It's around 25-30% last I checked, and that's just of core, right? Contrib is so much bigger. So from the community perspective, what we're dealing with are governance issues. What is expected of me as an open source citizen, and then what can I expect in exchange for that? So when we haven't defined it clearly, and we have people coming to use this tool that don't understand the norms and expectations that communities have, because to be fair, they're often unspoken, they're undocumented. When you come to my community, we're gonna have a whole set of expectations for how you're gonna contribute and how much you're gonna contribute versus how much you're gonna take. And I think those are the kinds of issues that we need to address through governance and just through education.
Yeah, I think that we spend a lot of time talking about what free and open source software is, but not as much time about why it has properties and what the power of those properties are. Right? And that all goes into setting the expectations when we are trying to build sustainable and diverse, thriving communities. It's about having common understanding on a set of beliefs and expectations for what it means to be a part of that community. And it doesn't feel like to me that we have as much of that kind of why. Do we think that these things that are, when we look at the open source definition, we have a lot of, this is a property of a license that is intended to perhaps ensure that someone has the rights and the freedoms to do something with the software, like in order to study it, to improve it, to sell it, right? Those are all properties of licenses, and we spend a lot of time kind of technocratically debating all the different properties of licenses, but we don't spend a lot of time actually writing down, like, what are the things that we believe as communities, and why is it important to the overall health and diversity of that community?
And when we get that wrong, and I'm not calling out Drupal, but it's what I know. When we get it wrong, we saw with the Drupal 7 cycle. It went too long. There was an assumption, a deeply held perception that Acquia was going to drive home Drupal 7, and it didn't. So our cycle ran 5 years. And in that 5 years, we missed an entire generation of web technology. So from the Drupal ecosystem, which is largely based around companies like mine that build on and with Drupal and hopefully give back upstream, when that upstream contribution didn't happen, it kind of stalled out. It took 5 years to get to Drupal 8. And Drupal 8's a fantastic product, and we've made governance changes so that doesn't happen again. But I will tell you, it was a really hard time in the Drupal ecosystem. Tons of businesses that had done really, really well just suddenly fell off a cliff, right? And so what I think is interesting about Drupal is that yes, there are some folks who build products, but largely it's a service-based ecosystem. Again, there's no single company that's out there building it. So we've all realized what we have to change to kind of keep it sustainable and keep investing in it at that level.
I want to draw some more attention to something that Matt said, because it was really, really great. And that was, you said that we were having these kind of technocratic conversations about, kind of what open source is, but not the why. And another facet of that is we're not only just having these conversations, but we're having them in very small places, right? To call back to Zahida's introduction, there are all these conversations going on Twitter. Raise your hand if you knew that there were really intense debates going on Twitter about this. Right, very small number of people. And you are the people who follow us on Twitter.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we are having these conversations, but we're not having them in a space where people can see them. Frankly, though, I don't think people want to see them, which is fine. That's fine. You get to choose that sort of stuff. But I think it's very important to call out the audience of these conversations and these technocratic things. And we are not doing a good job, I think, of including other perspectives in that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting balance, because on the one hand, there's an education problem with the history of open source and where it's come from. And if you don't understand where you've come from, then it's hard to know where you're going. And that's very real. And also the future of open source can't be rooted in the past of where open source was. It's going to be a thing that evolves and is different than it was 20 years ago, that was different than it was 10 years ago. And we don't know how now If we knew, then it would have been the same 20 years ago because we'd have predicted it. But we don't know. And so like where those boundaries and where those borders are, like that conversation, it can't flourish in a room that wants to gatekeep the conversation and wants to say, hey, you're not allowed to think this thought because we already learned that lesson 20 years ago. Like, well, maybe we did, but maybe we were wrong. Maybe that was the wrong lesson to learn. And like this comes back, I think, to that question about values where like if what we do is understand our shared values, then we can have a productive conversation about whether a given choice matches those values or whether we even share them, because maybe we don't, and that's okay. Like maybe we want to splinter and like not hang out together because our values are misaligned. Like there's a lot of people I don't want to hang out with because I hate their values.
And to Vicky's point, you know, the noise out there, it may sound a lot louder than it actually is if there's a small number, but they're the vocal minority. So did you have a point? I was going to hold on to your mic.
I had a question.
Go ahead.
And I think it goes to the other Matt, the smarter Matt.
Better dressed.
I'm losing all around. If you think, you said something about the why. A lot of the whole reason that we even have this session, keeping open source open, that, for example, AWS came out with an open Elasticsearch distribution. The reason that we're having the conversation is because I think we've lost a little bit of focus on the developer. I don't know that there's a single developer on the planet that said, man, I really wish I could get some proprietary features out at the edge so that I couldn't use those. There are maybe values to the companies saying we want to be able to invest in, so we need to be able to charge, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But for you, Matt, think about it from the AWS perspective. You guys, rightly or wrongly, I think sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, have come under criticism for not contributing enough. I'm going to put you in an uncomfortable position. From a customer perspective, which I know is your fetish, obsession.
Yes.
I'm trying to give Corey some stuff to tweet. Why should your customers care? And do they care?
Our customers do care about free and open source software because they're building things in the cloud using more and more free and open source software than they ever have before, right? And so they look at open source software as being something that's very high quality, something that they can find a lot of common developer experience in, because it of all the properties that I think make open source very powerful, right? So it's important to our customers for sure, and it's important, I think, because as individual developers on our individual developer type of journeys, the things that really frustrate developers, I think, are restrictions. And those can be technological restrictions, they can be business restrictions, they can be all kinds of different situations that you're put in that you have to go and try to find solutions to them. And I found in my professional experience, my personal experience, that open source solves a lot of challenges that are otherwise just really frustrating experiences, right? And so one of those experiences is a change of control of a piece of technology. Someone decides that you were paying $10 a year for something, and now it's going to be $20. And those are really frustrating experiences. And there are things that you don't have to deal with that with free and open source software. You can decide if you want to go to vendor A or vendor B to get support with it. And that if you have components of your technology stack that are providing a lot of value, that have a single vendor that is the only place where you can get it, that might be a delightful customer experience. There are lots of very successful companies that sell proprietary software, and that's great. But if you start kind of getting into situations where you think that you're using open source software, but you're not. That can be a place where suddenly you find yourself having to overcome a challenge that you thought that you weren't going to have to overcome because you went down the path of adopting free and open source software.
Well, I think it comes back to that notion of the public good, right? And as our lives become far more digital, I see software as the basic infrastructure of that. And there's so many of the needs that are filled by software that are shared. They're not proprietary, they're across the board. And so in the same way that we have, centralized our production of the roads, which, by the way, isn't how it started. Like roads originally when cars started to exist, all the roads were private, and you had different people paying for different roads, right? And we decided, well, maybe we should all pool our resources and do this and kind of create these roads, right? Software is a basic infrastructure of our digital world at this point. And you can go on your morning commute, or you could use your software, and you know where the potholes are, you know where the bodies are buried, and you can just drive around them. But what is nice about open source, it allows you to fix the pothole. And I think what I'm really interested in is how we manage issues of governance to create that kind of shared pool so that we can prioritize and incentivize fixing those shared needs, right? And there's a lot of different ways you can do that, right? Ultimately, that contribution comes down to time, talent, and treasure, right? Is it money that you have to give? Great. Give money, and somebody who has the time is going to fix that, right? Or someone who has the talent is going to fix that. So we have to just change the way that we're thinking, and this goes back to the piece of how we understand what this is moving forward.
Adam, I have a question for you. So if you were going to do an open source startup today, how would you start? Like, would you start with an open source license, a commercial license? Like, what would you do differently?
Would you make an open source?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I wouldn't start an open source company. So there you go. Does that make me lame? I would start a company, and I would build a product that customers wanted, and then I would look at the product that I had built, and I would look at the market that I believed existed for that thing, and I would decide if the right thing to do was to take that software and open source it so that I have a much larger channel for acquiring the customers that I desire in that target market. And I would think about that from on one level, my own acquisition. So like, what for a business, what open source does is it allows you to get the software in someone's hand. Then they can just use the software to solve whatever their problem is. That's very sticky. Like once you do that, you're like, oh, I love this thing. It fixed my stuff. And then you're like, oh, that's great. I have another thing. You want, if you give me $5, you can have more. And you're like, I'll give you $5. Like it super fixed my problem. And like that's a pretty easy sales cycle. So that's one piece. The other one would be, how do I feel about the creation of a competitive market? Because that's the other thing, that in order to get the maximum use out of the channel, you also kind of have to create. Because otherwise, everybody knows that it's just a thing that I'm going to ask you for money for later. How many people here use Sublime Text? How many people here kept using it by just hitting cancel on the nag? Every single one of you. Raise your hand again. And like, and that's the thing. Like, you knew when you downloaded it that was what was going to happen to you. And that's the same thing that happens when you download open source software. That like then later is gonna I'm gonna sell you stuff. Like even if you hit cancel, you know my sales rep's coming. Do you know what I mean? How many people here bought Chef? How many of you, when you started using Chef, thought to yourself, I hope a sales rep calls me? No hands. Same thing. So like, that multi-vendor channel, like you want to get to a place where multiple people are actually selling that product, and that competition can exist. And the reason is that it maximizes the utility of that channel, right? If it's good to have that channel for my business, then it's probably good to make that channel as big as it could possibly be. And the best way to make that channel massively huge is to get other people who also have an interest in having that channel grow, so that they put their time or their talent or their treasure, thank you for that, because I'd never heard it before she said it, but what a great phrase, against my outcomes. This happened for Chef first with Engine Yard, then with RightScale, then with AWS, then I can go on, but like it wasn't just Chef that made money on Chef. IBM has made more money on Chef than Chef has made on Chef. And like, you don't see me changing the license and yelling at them about what like murderous stealing people they are. I mean, I kind of want to, because they've been super lame, but like, that's fine. Anyway, point is, that I wouldn't start an open source business from the jump. I wouldn't say, I'm going to build a product and it's going to be open source. I might, if I suppose I should back up, maybe I would if I had sort of done the strategic analysis up front that told me that that product could only exist in that shape of the ecosystem. But I think those are very rare products.
Cool. Anyone else?
I'm gonna give a big +1 here. Out of the gate, I'm gonna do a whole heck of a lot of thinking before I go open sourcing something as my business. I'm more likely to build a really strong product, really satisfy my customers, provide value, and build a strong customer base and a strong brand. And then, once that's happened, try and release as much as humanly possible. But if I'm starting a business, I'm doing it because I got to keep my roof over my head. I got to pay rent. I got to keep, I have to keep my cats fed, not kids. I got to keep my cats in
That
the
can be expensive.
Oh, honey, trust me.
My cats eat raw meat. It's a thing.
Don't tell my cats. So if I'm doing a business, I have to keep my employees safe. And so I have to verify that I can do that. And if I can do that by releasing everything out of the gate, awesome. But by gum, I'm going to be doing a whole heck of a lot of thinking before that. I'm not going to listen to some VC who comes knocking on my door saying, I'm going to give you a $5 million, seed round or Series A, and you're going to release it. It's going to be awesome because lead generation. I was like, no, honey, you don't know how this works.
I don't know. Do you have $5 million?
Would I be here if I did?
Because I've taken the $5 million. It's great.
He's buying the rounds later.
Yeah, it's really good to take the $5 million. I think, I mean, we agree. It's maybe not even a twist, but I think the thing about deciding to open source it is about, if you're going to run a business, you have to create scarcity. There has to be something that you are selling that someone can't have unless they part with their money. And
I would disagree.
And okay, but I want to hear about that. But there's a lot of ways to create that scarcity that don't involve not open sourcing the software. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to build something that's proprietary. It can be like Red Hat style. The trademark is essentially what they hang their hat on. There's not a whole lot else there except for an incredibly deep trademark agreement, right? And so you can create that scarcity in a bunch of different ways. You just have to know how you're going to create it and what you're selling and what the value of that thing is, and build a business.
You finally got there. It's not about creating scarcity. It's about creating value.
Yes, of course. But if you
do that through scarcity, fine. But frankly, you do it by creating a product with a better value proposition than your alternative.
Yeah.
Let's say you are a cloud provider that has a cloud version of a service, and you're doing it better than the people who open sourced it and put it out there and created a company around it. That's not the problem of open source.
Yeah, well, it's also man, you're not doing a very good job of competing because man, you should
be
be able to lead them around by the nose because you're yeah, I built that thing. You're right, it's great.
Maybe you should take a few business classes.
Definitely.
So Vicky.
Oh, crap, I just spoke. Can't I hand it to Matt?
You can hand it to Matt, but I think this next topic I wanted to ask was to you on sustainability. So it's pretty key in open source.
Oh, it's going to be like the Vicky and Adam show.
So what is it, and what's the community doing about open source sustainability?
What the community is doing is the same thing the community always does, which is reinvent the bloody wheel instead of looking what other people have done in this world, in this industry. And, we think we have special, delicate snowflake problems. Again, we have unique problems. No one else has ever been through this before. Well, that's a load of hooey. I'm sorry. Back in the 80s, there is something called the Brundtland Report that came out. And it is an entire book that you can buy on the Oxford Press. And it's several pages, 300 pages long. You know what it's all about? Corporate sustainability. And there are so many excellent parallels between that and what free and open source software is going through right now. And instead of us bothering to look at what sustainability actually is, what other people, they took literally 900 days on this. And this was across the entire world. They had people working on this, very smart people. And they came up with some very smart ideas. And rather than looking what other smart people have done, which we should do since we are free and open source software, and this is kind of what we do. We build on those who came before us. We won't look outside of our stupid little bubble, of software and technology to look at what these other people have done. And the Brundtland report is brilliant, and it shows what these things have done. And we just focus on what we know. And that's building software and using money and giving money. And it's about so much more than that. And I've got a whole rant about this, but I'm going to do it for 45 minutes in Sydney in August. So come on down to PyCon AU, which, by the way, is a great conference. So
That's a great plug. I think Mike's got a question.
And I'm going to rant about it for 15 minutes on Thursday. So,
Now, this time I don't have a question. I have a comment. I think the whole open source sustainability thing is complete crap. I mean, it's complete crap. If you look at, we've had the same conversation for at least 20 years, and open source during that time, every single year of those last 20 plus years, we've agonized over how is this going to continue, and it keeps continuing and it keeps growing. The same percentage of super successful projects are out there as maybe more, maybe it's gone up actually, as 10 years ago. We don't have an open source sustainability problem. We may have an open source company sustainability problem, but we've always had that exact same problem. It hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. And part of it is because developers are going to use the software. It's increasingly, there's so much amazing software out there. That's not the problem. The problem is figuring out if there's a sustainability problem or a scarcity problem, it is around operationalizing that software. That's what AWS figured out, and what Azure, and Microsoft, and others. That's what Mongo finally figured out. That's why the company is doing so well right now. It's like, oh, we can have Atlas, and we can sell this database as a service. It'll be great. It's not about licensing changes. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about delivering customer value or developer value. And when open source has done that well, the sustainability problem goes away. I do think that people like, and I'm gonna shut up because I do think that the way that it shows itself as sustainable best is within foundations or projects like Drupal, where it is truly a community running it rather than one company. Because a company can die, hopefully a community won't.
And to build on that point, Mike, I agree with you. I think it really does come down to the community and the culture of the community. If we throw back to what we were talking about earlier, where open source has an opportunity to grow, it's in understanding the values and the why of open source, and that comes from the culture in the communities themselves. Like, we've all heard, come for the code, but stay for the community, and that's what's allowed Drupal to be successful. I think we're in our 18th year now as a project that doesn't have a single company behind it. And it's through this kind of reinvention of the community and the sustainability of the community itself, which requires continuous investment in what it means to self-govern and constantly striving for clarity around what our values are, what we expect of each other, and what you can expect from us as a project. And I think that's part of what the secret has been for Drupal that I've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, I think if there's a sustainability crisis, it is that we don't have one around money. So like there's plenty of open source, like getting funded to build an open source company is not like it's hard. It's hard to get funded, all that stuff is real. But like there's plenty of money. It's not a money problem. It's that. It's the okay, if it's this sustainable thing, how do we sustain it? How do we decide that it's gonna still be here when we're all dead? And that it's going to be being taken care of for the future generations who come after us. We don't talk about that at all. Instead, we're well, I don't know, if MongoDB doesn't get paid, might go out of business, won't be any more MongoDB. I'm wow, that's it? That was it? Feels weird.
And I mean, Matt did say that, this isn't an open source sustainability problem. It's a open company sustainability problem, I think is the way and no, that's not a problem. I mean, if you look at the statistics, within the first 5 years, 90% of companies, I don't care what your business model is, but 90% fail. I'm going to go back on this whole failure thing that I keep working on, but 90% of businesses fail. So this isn't about open source. It's about learning how to do your company. It's not about sustainability of open source. There is a lot to be done there. I'm not saying don't help sustain open source. I think we do need to do a lot to maintain free and open source software. But there are millions and millions of new repositories added to GitHub alone. Just GitHub, not including GitLab, not including any other system used. Millions every year. Some of them are even under OSI approved licenses, so they are open source. Do we need to maintain all of those? Cull the herd, folks. We don't have to support every single project out there, but as a company, you should sustain the ones that your company relies on. Because if not, I'm sorry, you're putting your company at risk and you're doing a very, very bad job of running a business.
So I guess just in kind of closing, I'd just like to ask each of you, but and listening to some of the points here, maybe you don't want to answer this question, but it was, what is your one request for companies and the community here to focus on, to keeping open source open? Whether that's kind of being more sustainable, more inclusive, obviously not sustainable from your perspective, Matt, but anyway, if each of you want to take that very quickly, just one point.
If you're setting out to actually build a free and open source software community, take the time to really understand what your beliefs are and how you want to kind of lay the foundation for setting expectations for what it means to build what you're building, why it is you're building it, right? Mm-hmm. And help actually write that down and use it to inform the decisions you're making. That could be what licenses you decide to use. It could be who you want to try to attract to collaborate with, but really try to make sure that there's a good understanding on the beliefs of the people who are setting out to establish a new community.
I think for me, the one piece I would ask, I think that if we're going to keep open source open, is we have to shift from this notion of transparency to one of clarity. Because transparency in and of itself can obscure these unwritten and unstated norms. But for open source to really remain open, we have to provide clarity around that mission, that purpose, and the culture, where you're going, what you expect and what is expected of you. And if we invest the time in really committing to clarity, I think that's what will help us keep open source open.
I'd put what they said, like 100%. And then I think I would add being clear about what you want other people to be able to accomplish. So, if I'm going to make money on this software, is it okay with me if other people do? And I may or may not choose a license that makes it hard for them. But if I can just say with a clear face, like with straight out, no one but me will monetize this software. And if you want to, you could maybe buy the license, but you're going to have to go over there. Like, I think that kind of clarity of just saying, look, like, what are we? Are we a community that's people together? Is it a freemium channel strategy? Like, what is the purpose of this thing? And it's bigger than the license.
Yeah, and I think related to that, and that would have been mine, was if you're focused on what the customer and the developers within that customer, what they need, I think it provides all sorts of clarity. If you're focused on guarding against competitors, I think you're probably going to get mixed up, and then we're going to be having this conversation 5 years from now at this event.
The one thing I would tell companies to do if they want to have sustainable open source is to get a bill of materials. Just figure out what open source you actually use and figure out what free and open source software actually matters to you. And then give back strategically, because just as free and open source software has limited resources, so do you as a company. You can't spread your peanut butter too thin. You just can't. You're not going to make that big of a difference. So, stick around, listen to Simon Wardley, use his maps, and figure out where you should be investing strategically for your company and free and open source software.
That's great. So lastly, just a key point here is that, what I'm hearing is like our biggest strength is really in an inclusive community, working together for a healthy, sustainable ecosystem, right? And that's kind of the messaging that we're hearing from the panel as well, so that we can be really kind of resilient and strong and have shared values and shared purpose in what we're doing going forward. As well as that, not just the community of developers and contributors, but also our community of users are very key as well. And that's really growing, especially certainly with AWS as customers are moving to the cloud. So I would like to thank this awesome panel for this engaging conversation. So thank you.